So welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy, and I'll serve as the faculty host today. Thrilled to have a full room, even with an eclipse, and what is undoubtedly the most beautiful day of the spring semester here in Cambridge. Also excited to have so many of our friends and colleagues and alumni joining us online via Zoom. This is a real pleasure today to host Todd Stern for this fireside chat without a fire, before we open it up for conversation from everybody. A little bit about Todd before we get started. Todd served as the Special Envoy for Climate Change from 2009 through early 2016. For 7 years of the Obama administration, serving as the lead and representing the United States in climate change negotiations over that time period. That's not the first time Todd spent time in government. He worked, I believe, all 8 years of the Clinton administration, first serving as assistant to the president, served as staff secretary in the White House. The last almost 2 years served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury. He has extensive experience engaging on international climate policy, and even after having left government, as recently as this morning, still helping out people thinking through climate policy as he participated, as he just alluded to me, in conversations with some counterparts around the world on a Zoom, I suppose, yes. Currently serving as a non-resident fellow at Brookings and an aspiring academic as he completes a book for MIT Press, which we'll talk about near the end of our talk, and perhaps going back into the classroom to teach this coming year. Also proud to have visiting us an alum of Harvard. Todd earned his law degree from Harvard Law School. Todd, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you very much. I ought to be able to just tell you guys one thing about Professor Aldy, which is that back in the day when I was still in the Clinton administration, these were the early days on climate, Joe somehow had managed to become a staff person for the Council on Economic Advisors, even though he had no appropriate degree to do that. he was nothing more than a BA. And because he did this, and because of his unbelievable prowess, even at that young age, he came to be known as Super Joe around the people who did climate change. So Professor Aldy, once upon a time, was Super Joe. So
I appreciate that.
I'm sure he's still super.
In my youth. So let's talk about your youth, though, to start with, about how you became a tree hugger.
Well, it is.
They're both green. Yep.
Am I coming through? Hello, hello?
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. So you didn't come into government as a tree hugger.
No.
You had worked for the legislative branch, for the Senate, for Senator Leahy and Senate Judiciary. You come into the White House, and among other things, you become staff secretary.
Correct.
Help us understand a little bit about what staff secretary's job does, and then some of the key elements of that actually help prepare you to then work on climate change.
Yeah, well, so the staff secretary is one of those important jobs that people don't know much about. I came in as the deputy. John Podesta, who went on to become the chief of staff for Clinton, was the staff secretary. It's the place where everything on paper that goes to the president comes to the staff secretary. If, at least when we were there, if they were substantive decision memos, we would always write a short synopsis to put on top of the longer memo. We would decide who else among the senior people in government in the White House needed to see and comment on the thing. We would talk to the chief of staff to say, this isn't ready to go to the president. Why don't you bring together these 8 or 9 people to try to work out their differences? So it had a lot to do with the decision-making process in the White House. And we also, starting with when John was there, got yanked into things that were outside of the four corners of our job, which could be anything from writing the internal investigation of the travel office report, which you people are probably too young to know ever existed, but it was a mess, and do tough nominations to help get them across, or end up getting pulled into substantive things. And that's what happened to me in maybe beginning of July of 1987.
Yeah. So part of it is that you started to earn this reputation within the White House as being a problem solver.
Yes.
You had this experience of like, how do we make sure that everyone who has an equity in a decision has their voice appropriately represented in that process, as it then feeds into information going up to the president.
Yes.
You then find yourself in this situation where the president realizes a lot of my peers around the world are talking about this Kyoto conference.
Yes.
And we need to up our game and get ready for it. So what did the president ask you to do in helping the United States prepare for the Kyoto conference?
So you're right. This happened right after a G8 meeting in Denver, and President Clinton came back a little chagrined that all of his peers seemed to be more on top of this, knew what their position was going into Kyoto than the U.S. So I got pulled in, and I was asked initially to do the communications part out to the public, and the sort of stakeholder piece, which involved meeting with environmentalists and business and labor. I joked at the time, after having sat in a meeting with the really top labor leaders in the country, all of whom were completely against this issue, that I was the only person in the government who could bring business and labor together, because they both hated climate change. So I got involved that way. But when I was first asked, I said my only condition, yes, I'd be happy to do that, but I had to be part of the policy team also. So because I couldn't do the other things without that, but also that was my interest.
Now, when you talk about how you brought labor and business together, we also saw how with the U.S. Senate, the looming Kyoto conference tended to bring together Republicans and Democrats. So it's one of these rare occasions where we saw a vote that was 95-0, which means there were 5 senators who were upset they were out of town that day, or say
before I got there.
Before you got so 95-0, referred to as the Byrd-Hagel resolution. That was sort of a sense of the Senate resolution indicating this is kind of what we expect the executive to bring back from the Kyoto conference.
2 things that they said, thou shalt not do this agreement if China and other big developing countries are being given a free ride, and you can't do it if it's going to hurt the U.S. economy.
Right.
But the first thing was what really was the most important.
Now, the challenging thing about that is that the world had decided at COP1 a couple years early in Berlin, the negotiating mandate really specified developed countries, you need to take the lead here. So how did you manage this kind of domestic politics?
More than that, more than just you have to take the lead. It was like, and no new commitment of any kind shall be asked of developing countries, no matter how relatively developed they are.
So you're trying to coordinate a process. You've got this domestic politics that, let's just say, isn't quite squaring with the international process. How do you manage that?
Well, see, the thing is, so I was green, not in the sense of environmental or greenbacks, but just in the sense of inexperience at that point. So I didn't, and I'm pleased to be able to say that nothing that happened in Kyoto was my fault. And so I really was not coordinating and making the whole. I mean, I was the senior person in the White House that went, and somebody from the White House needed to go, but this was really a State Department operation, and I learned a lot going to Kyoto.
Okay, so what do you see as the key takeaways, the key lessons you learned at Kyoto? And how did that sort of set the foundation for the next time you went into government?
Well, so there were lessons I learned in Kyoto itself, just about the kind of chaos of a COP, COP standing for Conference of the Parties. And I learned, and I actually turned this into an article that I wrote with, remember our old friend Bill Antholis?
Yep.
Bill and I wrote an article that was published that was basically said that there should be a I think we called it an E8, like instead of a G8E, like for focus on existential environmental issues, where you could bring together, it was a little more than 8, but you bring together a dozen or 15 countries a few times a year at a ministerial level, so they could talk in a sane environment instead of running around with not enough time, too many things to do, and all of that. So I learned that sort of procedural thing, which became quite important down the road. The substantive thing that I learned, which was even more important down the road, is that there was just no possible way to do an agreement structured like Kyoto, which is legally binding, very rigorous rules for developed countries, absolutely nothing for developing countries, and go ahead and get that approved. And most countries could do that. I mean, it wasn't like other countries don't have the burden that we face in the context of the what is known as the treaty clause of the U.S. Constitution, which says that the president can enter into treaties with the quote advice and consent, meaning approval of 2/3 of the Senate. So you talked about 95 to nothing on the Byrd-Hagel resolution. Yeah, we weren't getting any kind of 2/3, right? So so all of that I processed. I didn't know that I was learning this so that I would put it into play 9 years later, but yeah, that's what I learned.
Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. First, 2007, the climate change talks are in Bali. They come up with a negotiating mandate. There was a lot of pushback on the Bush administration then. One of the sort of famous quotes coming out of the plenary there to the US is either lead, follow, or get out of the way. They were tired of the US kind of just sort of stalemating international climate policy. So we get a negotiating mandate that is intended to culminate in a grand agreement in Copenhagen in December of 2009. Beginning of 2009, you come in as our first special envoy on climate change. The Obama administration taking a different approach than previously, where often it was the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs would lead the negotiations. But that portfolio is much broader than climate. Having one person to represent at the ministerial level of the United States, focus exclusively on climate change.
That was Hillary Clinton's idea, actually.
It was Secretary Clinton's idea. Okay. So you come in, and of course, I think the first meeting you go to is not a UN negotiating session, but it's a major economies forum meeting that has some similarities to this idea that you and Bill had worked on. So how do you think about the major economies forum? What exactly did that do? And how did that help sort of make progress over the course of 2009?
So the interesting thing is, so Bill and I wrote that article it was published in January of 2007, I think. And maybe 6 months later, the Bush administration started something they called the Major Economies Meeting. It was the same group of countries that we ended up using. The thing is, the Bush administration had less than no credibility on climate change. They had basically dropped out of the process back almost right away after Bush got elected. Partly because they thought Kyoto was a bust, and Kyoto sort of was a bust, but they didn't do it the right way. So they engendered a lot of ill will, and independent of that, they had no interest even domestically in doing anything, right? And Cheney was the vice president. He was a big oil guy. So there was nothing coming out of the U.S. But they decided to do this, and I don't know what was going on inside that administration that led them to want to do something a little bit positive. They started this, but again, the countries were supposed to at some point in that process say what they wanted to do by such and such a date, and the U.S. gave just a completely kind of piss poor. This is a term of art. Proposal, which was to say we will continue increasing our emissions until 2025, and that point we'll level them off. And it's like ridiculous. And so they had no credibility. We came in, but the fact that they did that and that I wrote the article, I'm quite sure we're not connected. I can't imagine they ever saw my article, but But I decided that we really did want to do this, that we needed a place where we could bring the senior people together on a regular basis and talk out of the craziness of the COP and build relationships and become sort of friends. And crossing like the major developing countries, the major developed countries. So we did all that. Because the MEM existed, we decided to take the same countries, because basically the right countries, more or less the G20 -3, but give it a slightly different name because the brand had to be different from the Bush brand, which was so bad. And it was probably the most important diplomatic thing we did over the 7.5 years that I was there, because it really did create this thing that I was hoping could be created, which didn't mean like everything was easy, but you got to know each other, you got to have real conversations and we deliberately never had what in the government are called deliverables. Like you have to produce a declaration, you have to produce something, and so you're negotiating that.
Right.
We did that once, the very first, in the first year in 2009, we did it because the leaders were meeting.
Right.
We brought had a MEF leaders meeting. When you pull leaders together, you kind of have to have something to show for it. So we negotiated this declaration, but that was the only time. And it was very intentional. Like people should just feel relaxed, loose, willing to say what's on their mind and not worry about an outcome. So it was actually really successful. And the biggest fan, as honest to God true, the biggest fan of the thing over the 7 years was Xu Zhenhua from China.
Okay, I want to get back to Minister Xi in just a moment, but it is interesting that Leaders' Declaration from L'Aquila in, I think it was July of 2009.
Yeah.
I believe is the first time we have any kind of international text that talks about limiting warming to 2 degrees C.
Yeah.
You had developed and developing countries both in rather qualitative manner, but talking about they would both take actions to mitigate emissions. How do you see that as setting the foundation for what was negotiated in Copenhagen and beyond?
Well, I think it was very helpful. I mean, it was helpful for starters in bringing. So the way the things always worked before is that, and there still are what's called intersessional meetings. So the big COP, the big conference of the parties, happens more or less at the end of every year. It could be November, it could be December, but it's at the end of every year. That's when the ministers come at these intersessional meetings that happen 2, 3, 4 times before the COP. There's no ministers there. You have senior negotiators. But what that means is if there's nothing else going on, the ministers don't know what's happening in a serious way until they show up at the COP. Well, that's like really bad. It's important that they get engaged. So part of the thing that was good about the MEF was that you got ministers engaged. The ministers would filter down to their, the people who worked for them and so forth. So, I mean, it was very useful in that sense. And it was useful, the declaration itself was useful because it showed ministers, in effect, and this might sound silly because you think, well, of course they're going to know what negotiating is. Not really, not necessarily. So it showed ministers what it took to negotiate. It showed that we could actually, even though people were on very different sides of things, could actually come to an agreement on, text that was not awesome, but it was not half bad. Right? I mean, it pushed in the right direction. All of that was useful. I don't know that the specifics of what was in the declaration were that consequential to Copenhagen, probably to some extent.
But it was getting at the ministerial level that worked together. We were starting to see heads of state,
right,
whether it was in Italy in the summer or New York in September or Pittsburgh at the G20. We're seeing more and more conversations about climate change at the head of state.
To that point, there's one other thing I should add, which is so the presidency of the COP in 2009 was Denmark, and Denmark was their main climate guy, the main strategist for their prime minister, is a guy named Bo Lidegaard. And Bo used to come to our MEF meetings, Major Economies Forum meetings, and he also was in L'Aquila. And what he took away from that meeting, among other things, was that you actually can get countries, these are all the most important countries, to come to terms on something that's not bad, but you can only do it if the leaders are there. Mm-hmm. Which led Denmark to take the extravagantly risky, crazily risky move of making the COP in 2009 a COP for leaders, so that the leaders were supposed to arrive in the last 2 or 3 days and get the deal done. I mean, it had never been done before. It was incredibly risky.
It may never be done again.
Well, I mean, it won't be done quite like that.
The French invited the leaders at the beginning of the Paris Conference 2015. We'll get to that in a moment. But,
okay, all right.
Yeah, but so we're in Copenhagen. There are these various lines of thematic negotiations coming out of the Bali negotiating mandate. And then we have the discussion of this parallel, much briefer document that eventually became known as the Copenhagen Accord, sort of so-called political agreement. So describe a little bit about that, which seems to reflect in part the sort of building of relationships at these sort of higher levels to at least agree on the big picture, while we're having the challenges on negotiating in the details coming out of the Bali mandate.
Yeah, so the negotiations were really not going anywhere. The negotiations of everybody. Again, going back to Kyoto, I came into the job with, if I had one kind of article of faith that was completely central, was we were not going to do Kyoto again. And not doing Kyoto again meant to me we were not going to do a legally binding agreement, which would require the US to get 67 senators to say yes, which would never happen. They wouldn't have said, you wouldn't have got 67 senators to say yes to the Declaration of Independence if it said climate at the top. So that was really important, and I knew that we couldn't. The prevailing paradigm of the international negotiations was still the Kyoto paradigm. So we got to do something new, but it's got to be legally binding, at least for the developed countries, and then someday for the developing. But developed countries will take the lead, and the big developing countries will come on board soon, and that's the paradigm. And so again, I came in and that was an impossible paradigm. So I couldn't come in just saying that on day one, because that would not have gone over very well. But we knew that we had to get there. And we had talked to Bo, and we had talked to, any number of people. And so he decided, he came to see us actually in September with this new idea for a Copenhagen Accord, which would be non-legally binding for everybody, where everybody would have to agree to, at least all the big countries, to emission cuts and a bunch of other things, but the whole thing to be like 6 or 7 pages. Right? And that then started to move on its own track, where the negotiations were not actually moving. They were on another track, but they were kind of stalled. You had 100 pages of text with of the main negotiations, because it's a compilation text. So on every provision, there's like 7 different alternatives, and that's why it gets so big. And that was going nowhere. Anyway, yeah.
Thursday night of the second week, you sent Pete Ogden to me. Pete was Todd's chief of staff. You sent us around to there's about a dozen of those different Bali negotiating lines. You sent us around to all the breakout rooms just to make sure, even though at that point we knew there was going to be something that was a Copenhagen Accord, we just wanted to make sure there's no mischief brewing out there, and just to check in with all of our staff level negotiators.
I did that.
Yeah. So we went into the room on shared vision.
Yeah. How was it?
Shared vision was not shared. Shared vision. At the time we walk in, we walk over to our counterparts, the State Department negotiators there, and one of the co-chairs is speaking and talking about how the entire text, I've told this story recently in one of my classes, the entire text is bracketed. Okay, so what that means is that like any text that's bracketed means we don't have agreement on, and they're imploring for those in the queue to make comments, to make a suggestion on text that you think will address the concerns others have raised so we can remove brackets. Inserting another set of brackets.
This is on the second to last day.
Second to last day.
Right.
Inserting another set of brackets has no bearing on this. Whether it has 2 sets of brackets or 3 sets of brackets, it means we don't agree. So then they go to the queue. The next country says they have significant problems with this paragraph here, and they want to put some brackets around it. And you just see the co-chair, just his head drops, and Pete and I look at each other and we're like, okay, nothing's coming out of this session today. And we moved on to the next room. But it's just to illustrate like how we were at this point where we're like, the status quo doesn't work, but there was not agreement on where to go forward. And so we have what has been described in the media, Copenhagen being a failure, but it really forced a kind of reckoning in the international climate negotiations to say what can be an alternative path forward where we get meaningful progress by some of the biggest emitters in the world.
Yeah, all of that is true, but the whole conference was kind of was shocked and stuck by a decision of somebody, China, India, whoever it was, probably China, but we don't know, leaked to the Guardian newspaper in London that there was this secret negotiation going on, and that the Danes meant to, with the big developed countries, were going to completely mess up everything that had been established in this UNFCCC process. Completely illegitimate, was going to be unfair to poor countries, and so none of this was this was not a shock, right? There had been a 2-day meeting a week before Copenhagen started with 30 countries, half developing, to talk about the Copenhagen Accord, but it was like it was all of that was forgotten, and it was like this was just this new thing and this awful thing. And so it was stopped all the way up until, and all sorts of efforts to get the negotiations going. Denmark had lost all of its credibility at that point. And at the first meeting was at 11. There was a meeting finally pulled together of the Friends of the Chair, of Friends of Denmark, 30, 25 countries, which was pulled together on Thursday night. Yep. At 11 o'clock after a dinner hosted by the Queen of Denmark. And the Danes went around and got people to come and got the leaders to come. So you had all of these leaders sitting around.
Secretary Clinton is representing the United States. The president's flying in the next morning.
The president flew in the next morning, and it appears to be a complete failure with nothing going to come out of it, but then something did come out of it, and it was a valuable start, as you've said.
It's a valuable start. So we get the Copenhagen Accord. Then moving forward, when you sort of think about, okay, this is year 1 of the Obama administration trying to engage more constructively on climate policy, an incredible amount of effort at very high levels. Secretary Clinton was more engaged on this than probably any other previous Secretary of State. President Obama had spent more time in that first year, whether in bilateral meetings, MEF, G8, G20, and then multilateral settings. And we're just getting started, right? Yeah. So take us then on the road, and then what happens, how we start to take what's that sort of short document in Copenhagen, we get it expanded and elaborated in Cancun, but importantly, we're setting the stage then for Durban and what comes next in the negotiations.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that was most important about the Copenhagen Accord, short as it was that it basically did follow the kind of paradigm that we needed. And I mean, this can be very frustrating for countries around the world that you have to like do this because that's what the United States says. But on the other hand, you need the United States, and there was no way to do an agreement that was going to pass through the Senate. So the Copenhagen Accord had the major countries all agreeing to do their thing. They were going to do their thing in the sense of these are the emission reductions that we're going to make. And it was non-binding, so everybody was on the same legal level, not binding legal for you and not for you. And so that, and there was it got done, but then these things have to, agreements always have to get accepted at the end by the Conference of the Parties. And here's one little trick about climate negotiations that tell you why they're so particularly enticing, which is it's 195 countries and they all have to agree. There's it's kind of crazy, but it's a quasi rule of consensus. If it's 3 or 4 small countries who don't want to agree, maybe it'll get done anyway. You know, the chair will look out and say, "See, no objection," and hit the gavel. You can't do that if there's any real disagreement. So you have that. It breaks down. Joe, you have the Copenhagen Accord. It breaks down in the plenary where it needed to get approved.
Heads of state are already flying home.
Heads of state have flown the coop, and Obama left because a huge snowstorm.
Blizzard was coming to DC. Yeah,
it came to be known as the snowpocalypse in Washington, and he had to get back because he had other things to do, like the healthcare bill.
Right.
So, in any event, there was a revolt in the plenary. Ultimately, there was an agreement that it wouldn't be adopted, but it also wouldn't be completely thrown out. It would be taken note of, which is a sort of term of art within the UN, which was incredibly important because it kept it alive. It wasn't an accepted sort of an accepted agreement that had been done within the context of the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change process. But on the other hand, it had been taken note of. It was relevant. It was the thing that then in without going into the details of the next COP in Cancun, the 2.5 pages of the Copenhagen Accord ended up being the 30 pages expanded, but all the same substance. And then of the Copenhagen Accord. The following year, then Durban was a time when countries pushed to have a mandate for a new negotiation because yes, we got this thing done, but it still wasn't good enough. And that turned into Durban producing the mandate for the negotiation that ended up in Paris, with all of the seeds planted in Copenhagen.
So when we think about that road from Durban in 2011 to Paris in 2015, I'll make a personal note. In 2012, I believe it was, I joined you in Chicago.
Yeah.
It was, some of you may be familiar with so-called track 2 exercises, where we get people from 2 countries who aren't in the government together to sort of talk about a specific issue and come up with ideas that they could actually then report back to individuals in the government to help them sort of think without the pressures of these sort of existing political relationships, et cetera. Todd had organized a track 1.5. Right. So the government officials were there, including Minister Shia. And you know, if you're going to be in Chicago, and I want to say maybe like sort of late summer, early fall, I think you took Minister Shia to a Cubs game, right?
I did. Yeah, it was great.
So part of this is, you know, I'm not sure if any other climate negotiators had taken Minister Shia to a soccer match in Europe or what have you, but talk a little bit, though. You've got the 2 biggest economies in the world, the 2 biggest sources of emissions in the world, the view of sort of like here, you know, if we're going to be successful, we have to have these 2 countries working together. Talk about the importance of building the relationship and the trust with Minister Shia as you're on this process going to Paris.
Yeah, well, so that was an incredibly important relationship, and we were super lucky because I'm just a huge fan of Xi Jinping. He just became a close friend, and we differed and bickered all the way through till, you know, a meeting at midnight in Paris 2 days before the end. We were still fighting, but a wonderful guy, and not just a wonderful guy, but super smart and effective and with clout within the Chinese system. So The very first time I met him, though, was March 9th of 2009 in Washington. And I said to him, and relations between the U.S. and China were always difficult, although not nearly as tense and difficult as they are now. But they were all, but most issues were conflictual issues, and that was no different with climate change historically. But I said to him, I think that you and I should try to make climate change a positive pillar in this often fraught relationship. This is something we can do. And he was sort of open to that. And that, now having said that, like, we disagreed like crazy, and we did not. I think it changed for China after that first year. I think they came away from Copenhagen thinking that had been a really bad experience for them, because they tried their damnedest to just run the clock out so there could be no outcome at all other than we're going to continue negotiating next year. That's what China wanted. I mean, that's explicitly what they wanted. And that failed in the end. And it not only failed, but it failed with them looking like they were against the poor countries, right? Because, like, one of the things in this little Copenhagen Accord document was language that not only said below 2 degrees, you talked about the first time it came up, but that added some not great language, but it made the point, and it was at the request and really the pleading of the small islands, to put something in there to say that we might have to re-look at this and with a view toward holding to 1.5. And the Chinese, and this was at the very end of the leaders meeting of around 30, and we were all saying yes, and the Chinese wouldn't budge. Ultimately gave in, but they really set themselves up against these most important things for poor countries. And I think they came away thinking that was a bad idea, and that being publicly in opposition in a fight with the United States didn't come out so well either. So I think after that, the positions on key issues were quite different, but there was, I think, always a sense that we were going to try to work something out.
Right.
And that's where Xi was great.
So we're in the run up to Paris. The COP before that, usually the COP right before a big meeting, is trying to get some of the, hopefully an easy win, or at least getting some progress made. But before we go to the Lima COP, US and China bring out this announcement about sort of common interest, both in domestic efforts to reduce emissions, but how they want to work together internationally. So talk a little bit about that effort.
So we'd actually, so John Kerry came in as Secretary of State in 2013, the beginning of Obama's second term. And there were a number of positive things that happened between the US and China during the year of 2013, which included negotiating a little agreement having to do with something called HFCs, which are potent industrial greenhouse gas. So it had been a good year, and Kerry had gone and wanted to set up a US-China working group to work on technology stuff together. Really good idea. So he calls me up to his office in January. He was sitting in front of his fire with his pet Labrador, which he loved to bring to work, and he said, so, we had a good year, what do we do for non-core? We have to do something big, and which is one of the great things about John Kerry. I mean, he has this is ups and downs, but he's like an activist, right? He just what's the next? We did well. What's next? So I met with my team, and we came up with an idea and when it wasn't my idea in the first instance at all, but I ultimately warmed to it. The idea was, what if we could get Presidents Obama and Xi basically to walk down the aisle together in China and announce our intentions for Paris, what our emission reductions were going to be for Paris, and that kicked off a 9-month secret negotiation, and it had to be secret because it was not at all clear that this would work. I mean, we could agree in principle with China, which we did quite early. Once we proposed it, and I went with Kerry China in February, and he met with Xi Jinping and all the top brass and talked about this idea. And yes, well, let's go ahead and try to do it. But you couldn't know you were going to do it until you knew what for us anyway, until we knew what the Chinese proposal was going to be in terms of reducing their emissions. I mean, if it was too weak, if it was too mealy-mouthed, then we can't have Obama up there basically giving a big hug to President Xi. And China already by that time was by far the biggest emitter in the world. It's more than twice the size of the US now. So we couldn't know. So we had to keep it secret. So so anyway, Carrie and I went, we got it launched. And then there was this back and forth, several trips to China, and we actually had both sides the technical people who were working on how do we get the emissions reductions that we need, what kind of reductions can we expect, and so what are you doing in terms of your domestic policy? Right. So our guys and their guys work together to some extent, and then in terms of the operational part of this during the 9 months. At that point, John Podesta was, at that point, he was chief of
senior advisor.
I can't now. John was back in the White House.
Right. Yes. Yep. Yep.
And no, he had been brought in to oversee the implementation of Obama's climate action plan, which he had announced in 2013. So John and I then, with our teams, negotiated this thing with the Chinese over 9 months. And it was, when it was announced, it was the front page of every newspaper in the world. People were absolutely, and the press had no idea. They were completely stunned, which is why, another reason you want to keep it secret. And it was at some level the single most important thing on the road to Paris, because what it said to countries all over the world was, even though it's been 20 years that we've been trying to get an operational agreement, after the framework agreement happened in 1992, but an operational agreement, who's got to do what in what way, had never happened. I mean, Kyoto, but it failed.
Right.
So anyway, it was just a huge event, and it made countries all over the world, including countries who were complete antagonists of ours, to think this can happen. And suddenly the US was like, guys from Bolivia and other places that had been really hard on us. It really dramatically changed. So we still had a hard negotiation for 2015, but people believed it was going to happen. And at the point when countries showed up in Paris, 182 countries had already submitted their proposed reductions, I think very significantly because of what happened with China.
So what do you take away? We successfully negotiated a Paris Agreement, entered into force in record time.
Yes.
So had ratification by enough countries to enter into force basically a year later. We've now seen its initial implementation. Countries have enhanced, as the term of art goes, or updated their emission mitigation pledges. In Dubai, we just had our first global stock take. So when you sort of look at this, what do you see as like, okay, this was the vision of Paris. Here's what's working well. Here's what needs to be improved.
Well, so I think that the Paris Agreement itself, now, the thing you didn't say, we don't need to spend any real time on it, but 4 days after it came into force, and that's actually 2 years, because it had to, after you signed everybody up, it took a little while longer before it could actually come into force. It came into force 4 days before Donald Trump got elected. So 4 days after it had come into force, you had the guy who was going to pull us out of Paris elected. But that wasn't your question. What
I wanted to go beyond that.
Yeah. Look, I think the Paris Agreement itself is a very good agreement. The shortcomings that people cite, it's not legally binding. It doesn't force countries to make the kinds of reductions that we have to, that if you could wave a wand and do, you would do. But again, none of the things that has been criticized for not including were remotely possible to be negotiated, because again, remember, everybody basically has to agree. So Paris is quite like is a very, very strong agreement for what it can be. It sets up a kind of renewing structure, because every 5 years countries have to put in a new target, and every 5 years that new target has to be better than the one before, or is supposed to be better than the one before. And that's every 5 years. On a staggered every 5 years, there's what's called a global stocktake. So you look at what all the countries in the world are doing, add it up together, look at what the science says, and then comment on it. And in fact, in the first global stocktake just happened in Dubai. So all of that is good. What's not so good is we're not nearly cutting fast enough. And like, as I look at climate broadly right now, I mean, I sort of think there's three big factors that are going on right now. The first is that the science and the impacts of climate change are coming faster and harder than anybody anticipated, right? So in the period between 2016 and 2020 already, there was a big movement from 2 degrees being a sort of relatively safe goal to 1.5. That thing that the island states were talking about all the way back in Copenhagen, that came to be the consensus, right? So it's moving faster, and it's moving, and the impacts are worse, and that's all based on what scientists call linear change, just getting a little bit worse each year. There's also this whole other bunch of scary things, which are called tipping points. And at a certain tipping point, then if you know what the game Jenga is about, like, you know, you pull one block out at a time and try to keep the structure out. But at some point, you pull one out and everything collapses. That's what a tipping point's like. Suddenly, a dramatically different state of affairs. So that's one thing. So worse in science, worse with respect to science, and worse with respect to the impacts which you see, which again, all over the world, quite stunning. I mean, if you really looked at them and paid some heed, it's like shocking. At the same time, spectacular progress beyond what anybody expected in terms of clean technology. I mean, if you look at what the kind of traditional, conventional, most highly respected modelers were saying in 2007 or 10 or whatever about where we were going to be with respect to wind and solar and electric vehicles and batteries and on and on and on, nowhere near, right? I mean, it's happening at a spectacular rate, which is very encouraging. And now, partly because Paris was done in the first place, and partly because there is obviously a more and more focus, there's a tremendous community here in the US, but all over the world, of innovators in government labs, in startup companies, working on every aspect of the clean energy dilemma. And this can mean like better and better technology of what you've already got, or it can mean completely new technology. You know, green hydrogen is one of the things that's a big deal now, and could help with what's called the sort of hardest to abate sector, the kind of heavy industry, steel and cement and aviation and shipping. But there's just tremendous, like, it's just outpouring of innovation, which is all really good. And if there were no hurdles, if there was no like political economy, factor working against you, you'd say, like, I think we're going to get to net zero, which is if you think about 1.5 degrees, that in turn translates into getting to net zero emissions by around 2050. Net zero
globally.
Globally. And the net means if you have some emissions, and they're offset to it, it's like no net emissions for the year. So you'd look and you'd say, yeah, I mean, the progress is so great that we might actually be able to do that. The problem is there's resistance. That's what I mean by obstacles, right? And the biggest form of that resistance is this big, hairy thing called the fossil fuel industry. And they're really powerful. And they're powerful that's both state-owned, and that's Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and all of those players, but also Exxon and the big. So that's a big factor because they want to keep producing, and because they have tremendous clout in countries all over the world. They have clout in the United States, they have clout in China, they have clout in India, they have clout all over, and they're trying to slow things down. And there was they were there in force at the COP this past year in Dubai. It's an interesting place to hold a COP, but some progress was made in that regard. So you say it's coming at us faster. The technology is fabulous, but there's these forces of stasis that don't want us to go as fast as we should. And the whole thing is a race against time.
Yeah. So
nobody should be depressed about any of this. It should, if what I say when I talk to anybody in groups about this, it's just like you got to get engaged, and you gotta like we need norm change. We need like hearts and minds more than anything else. And I'm serious.
Yeah.
The one thing that I remind people of is if you go back to the wild and woolly days of the 60s and early 70s, 1970 was the first Earth Day. The Earth Day was organized by a senator from Wisconsin named Gaylord Nelson. Nelson, yeah. And he thought maybe because we were in an era where there was so much activism because of Vietnam, because of the civil rights movement, because of the women's movement, that maybe he could translate some of that. So he tried to get this thing called Earth Day going, and to have a sort of with an old 1960s word, teach-ins all over the country. 20 million people hit the streets. 20 million, and in short order, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded. The Clean Water Act was passed. The Clean Air Act was passed, and on in the presidency of Richard Nixon. So activism matters. Okay, sorry, Joe.
No, that's great. I want to say that I'm soon going to go to the audience for questions. So we'll have a mic ready that we'll pass around. But I want to look forward for a little bit. Your old pal, John Podesta, has a big portfolio now for President Biden, both how we're going to implement the Inflation Reduction Act and move clean energy investment throughout the economy, but also now filling the shoes of Secretary Kerry, who left as special presidential envoy for climate change. So John is now engaging partners around the world.
Right.
One of the tasks, let's operate in a scenario in which President Biden is reelected.
Yep.
President Biden then, early in 2025, would be expected, the US government would be expected to submit its planned next emission pledge under this Paris framework. So how would you advise John and how to think about the key considerations in going into that next pledge?
Well, I do advise John, off the record. No, no. I guess what I would say is, obviously, we need to have the term of art is NDC, nationally determined contribution. That's what your target is called in this world, and obviously that has to be good. That's not the big issue. The big issue right now is finance for the developing world. And it's got a lot of attention. It should have a lot of attention in many respects. I think it's the most important issue out there, both because countries need it for multiple reasons, which includes building resilience against the extreme events that happen to your country, building your country building your economy in a green way rather than than using fossil fuels. All of that's important, as a genuine issue in itself. It's also important because it is a source of unbelievable stress and anger in the what is lately called the global South. So we've kind of got to make that work much better than we've made it work before. The vehicle for making it work, I think, and I'm not at all a finance person, but is the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, which can be put to much more potent use than they have been. But that's the thing that needs to work. And if Biden gets so this year is last year was there've been important reports that actually Larry Summers was who I worked for when he was Secretary of Treasury back in the Clinton days, but he and a well-known Indian economist were asked by the Indian government as the chair of the G20 meeting last year to put together a report on what to do. There have been a number of reports, but that one was really good. It's called the Triple Agenda. The whole set of things that ought to be done, that could be done, that ought to be done. And that was the EU call I was on this morning was on that.
Okay.
Actually, John spoke on that in that Zoom meeting. So it needs to happen, like, again, for the sake for itself, but it also needs to happen for a political purpose, in my judgment, to kind of reignite a super important coalition that got pulled together in the Paris days, which came to be known as the High Ambition Coalition. It was poor countries and vulnerable countries and progressive countries on the developing countries side, the EU, US, and and most of the developed countries. Over 100 countries pushing all in the same direction hard in Paris, which I think actually was very helpful for France, who had the pen, in making Paris as ambitious as it was. And there still is, there's still a group called the High Ambition Coalition, but it's not like it used to be. Okay. And I think you're not going to get developing countries to buy in as long as they're just enraged about, and it goes beyond climate. It's the debt. They need debt relief. They need all sorts of things that involve money. And I think we've got to produce that. And in doing that, I think we can also help to get the kind of momentum we need on the emissions reductions. Again, which now China is a third of all the emissions in the world actually are from China, bigger than all the developed countries put together. China's been doing great things on renewable energy, but also still building coal plants hand over fist. So that's what I would say. I mean, there's a lot of issues, but I think if you got the money right, you get the rest of it right.
Okay, great. Let me open it up to questions from the audience, please. Right.
Thanks for being with us. I'm Emil, an MPV student from Denmark. So interesting to hear your take. I'm very curious on your take on the amount of corporate participation in the recent COP conferences. Yeah. Do you think it's turned into a circus that is watering every opportunity to actually build real legislation? Like, has turned into a circus, or is it, back to your point around finance, actually a good thing that we see more private sector involvement?
I think it's a good thing. It's not so much a good thing for the finance thing that I was just talking about, but one of the leads for France during 2015, a negotiator named Laurence Toubiana, had the idea of trying to make the so-called non-state actor part of which can mean states and provinces and cities and companies and NGOs and the civil society, all make that a bigger part of it. Had always sort of been on the side of the cops, and it still at some level has to be on the side, but it's built up to be much bigger, and it was by far bigger. Like in Dubai, I think partly because they had a gigantic and very effective venue for it, but I think that's good. I think to some extent you have companies that are trying to look good as opposed to actually do much. That is still better than if they don't care about it. I mean, they're trying to look good. They're trying to look good because they're concerned about their customers, the smart young people they're trying to recruit, you know, whatever. And then there's also really a lot of companies that are trying to do better. Our friend Nat Cohen was in, who used to work in the White House, was in Dubai, and he wrote something afterwards saying that the engagement by companies was better than they'd ever seen it, that he'd ever seen it. It didn't seem at all phony. It seemed companies really trying to wrestle on what to do. So I think it's a much better thing than a worser thing.
Let's go up here to the front row, please.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear both of you. Holly Kaufman, a long time ago mid-career graduate from here before I went to negotiate in the Clinton administration. So you talked about the importance of finance and activism, which I think helps to move governments. But you also mentioned the Exxon Mobils in the world. So naive a question as this may be, how do we deal with the ongoing profit motive of the state and privately owned petrochemical fossil fuel companies who are now pushing other products like plastics so that they can keep making what they do? I mean, I have not cracked that nut yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's because it's a really hard nut to crack. I think there's a couple of things to be said. The first is that part of the problem, you're the economist, not me, but part of the problem will be solved, only part, but part of the problem will be solved by a loss of demand. I mean, if we fast forward 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, probably not 5 years at this point, but if you imagine a mostly electric vehicle fleet all over the world, then you've taken, I don't know what the percentage is you've taken out of what the oil and gas companies sell, but big, really big. And if you then also do the same with trucks and the same with shipping and so forth, then you're taking a bunch of demand away, which is going to start to shrink the companies by definition. That's part of it. The other part of it, I think, is to the extent, I mean, there is no perfect answer here, that's for sure. But when I talk about needing to change norms, to change hearts and minds, I mean, the reason I think about that, I talk about that, is because at the moment that these players have a lot of influence with politicians, but if a politician thinks that these other people are strong enough to have him be an ex-politician, then you're going to get greater movement, greater willingness to go against what the oil companies want.
Right. In the back, please.
Hello, hi, I'm Joya. I'm actually from Mauritius. I've just been admitted into the MPA program. I wanted to know how, because I've heard of the Green Climate Fund and the Loss and Damage Fund.
Yeah.
How does that fit into what the developing nations are able to, take out? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, they fit in. They are, the Loss and Damage Fund was just recently set up. The Green Climate Fund was an idea back in 2009, got set up. It has it's a relatively small amount of money, and they don't have the kind of capabilities that places like the multilateral development banks have at all, and they don't have the capacity to multiply the amount of money that they have by using various kinds of financial mechanisms. So they're kind of inherently not as effective. They happen because there's this outcry within the UNFCCC system, like the climate system, which is spectacularly lacking in any kind of financial acumen, right? So countries, negotiators want to have a thing. They push hard enough, they get the thing. The thing's not actually as useful as sort of other things might be, but on the, it's completely.
But it's their thing.
No, but I'm not. I actually not. I don't mean to be knocking it. I mean it's understandable that countries want to see that, but you're not. But they also run in a way which is inherently a little bit politicized. They don't run like a serious financial institution. You've got to like try to please. It's just much more politicized than it should be, and so they get created. I think that the loss and damage fund is being created. I expect that orders of magnitude more money will flow for loss and damage through the multilateral development banks and other means aside from the fund. But nonetheless, it's there and it's symbolically important, and it's really important with respect to however much money can get put in there.
Thanks for this very engaging talk. Tibisai Morgandi, I'm a Harvard alumna and currently Associate Professor of International Energy Law at Queen Mary University in London. I was wondering what you thought about these domestic and regional frameworks that impose reporting obligations on companies, especially when we talk about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Is this a helpful way to break down emissions for companies? And then also this new wave of due diligence requirements, which actually asks companies not just to report, but to start doing something. And if they promise they will do something, then, and they don't, they get fined in the end. And this also effort at the European Union level with this corporate sustainability due diligence directive, do you think that's a good way to bring them on board, but also make them commit to something that then is measurable to some extent?
Yeah, I'm all for that. And I think that the disclosure rules are being considered. They're under consideration in the United States right now. There are disclosure rules in the EU that I think exist, and I think that that's good. Look, I think all sorts of things that get companies to focus on this, worry about it. I think that one of the different categories of money that people who are focusing on this in the US and Europe and around the world, one of the categories is what gets called innovative financing. What that means usually is some form of taxes. But I think there's a quite serious process going on in the international IMO, the International
Maritime Organization.
Organization, to have what's basically a kind of a tax on their system to generate funds and to both generate funds and to give an incentive to the shipping to use non-fossil fuel methods. And I'm all for that, and the degree of the financial stress that exists around the world right now is forcing a turn to, and this will be like, hard for me to imagine that this will actually succeed because of what it's up against, but it should succeed, which is to tax fossil fuel companies it can be if you're taxing them at a very small amount, if it's 1% or whatever, you raise a huge amount of money, and that's just the polluter pays kind of principle, and of course it should work. I mean, what we have instead is still something like $700 or $800 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies which don't go very much to poor people. If you said you can leave all the ones for poor people, but take away all the rest, you would have taken away probably 75%. But that's violently resisted because of that same, political economy force that they have.
I think this point is really important that when we think about transparency, because this is part of Copenhagen and Paris.
Yeah.
Really raising our game in terms of reporting and transparency, and seeing that as one of the enablers for more ambitious action. And I think that's the view as well. And for companies that are voluntarily taking on goals, like if you're going to take on a goal, you need to be very transparent in your reporting your emissions and your actions, and that creates, I think, levers that various stakeholders can pull or push, if you will, to try to ensure that there's progress made on those goals. Just as we see it as a way to try to push on countries that have voluntarily taken on goals to see what kind of progress they're making on that in the international
I agree,
process.
and just I'm not going to go into this in any depth because it would take too long. But there's tons of companies who have taken on some sort of net zero pledge commitment, and that's great. But it's not so great that an awful lot of them have absolutely no idea how they're going to get there, other than that they're going to buy credits. And beware of those credits. Credits are there's probably some way to do some credits that are not, dubious, but an awful lot of them are dubious. And there's an awful lot of companies who are making these pledges because they're going to buy their way out, and it's not going to work.
Okay, so September 17th, MIT Press will release a book entitled
Landing the Paris Climate Agreement, that's the title. How it happened, why it matters, and what comes next. Yes, that is coming up.
Yes, and I believe Todd will do an event at Harvard Bookstore on September 18th. Is that right?
Very first, the launch event is right here.
Yeah, so keep your eyes open for that. Next week, we'll be hosting Wake Smith, who will be giving a talk on solar geoengineering. So please join us for that. And finally, please come to that one. You're invited if you want to come back up. Finally, please join me in thanking Todd Stern for his insights and for his service. Thank you so much, Todd. That's fantastic.
Thanks. That's great. Good. And now there's a few